And joining us now on the debate in Hartford, Connecticut, James Hughes, Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies at Trinity College. And here in studio, Madeline Ashby, science fiction writer and the author of the forthcoming novel VN. Jesse Hirsch, President of MetaViews.ca, the internet think tank. And Robert J. Sawyer, science fiction writer extraordinaire, author of Wonder and 20 other fantastic sci-fi novels. That's right. RJ, great to have you back in here. To our other friends as well, and to James Online in Hartford, great to see everybody today. One of the reasons we're doing this program is because you, this weekend, are going to be on TVO Saturday and Sunday, 5 p.m., with your Big Ideas literary review of Canada talk about why you are, unlike almost everything else we read, see, and hear about, optimistic about the future. And we are going to talk about optimism about the future, but first of all, we want to start with this. Surviving Progress is a 2004 documentary based on the Massey lecture by writer Ronald Wright, and he's going to get us kicked off here with a bit of a discussion of the other side of the coin. So here's a little excerpt from Surviving Progress, and we'll come back and talk. Michael, tape please.
In defining progress, I think it's very important to make a distinction between good progress and bad progress. I mean, things progress in the sense that they change. Both in nature and in human society, there appears to be a clear trend towards increasing complexity as change proceeds. We tend to delude ourselves that these changes always result in improvements from the human point of view. We're now reaching a point at which technological progress and the increase in our economies and our numbers threaten the very existence of humanity.
Okay, small clarification, Lecture 2004, documentary just out recently. Robert, start us off here. Why do so many people these days seem to see the future so apprehensively?
Well, we live in a very changeable time. Lots of things are changing, and change is something to be frightened of. And people have very short memories. In the nice clip there, we heard that we're reaching a point where progress threatens humanity. We reached that point in 1945 when we invented atomic weapons. What's amazing is in all the time since, except that one time, we have never used them on people. Never, never. The United States and the Soviet Union stood down from the verge of destroying each other. So although it's always in vogue to say we're at the precipice, we're about to fall over, it's about to come to an end, in fact, the history of the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st is one of increasing prosperity and peace around the world.
That is true, but James, let me bring you in to ask you this. No nuclear weapons have not been used since Nagasaki in 1945, but everybody you talk to in the national security establishment of your country fears that some kind of nuclear suitcase bomb is going to go off in Times Square tomorrow. Why do we consistently see that as the potential view of the future?
Well, I would go back to reasons to be optimistic. First, the work that Steven Pinker has recently done that helps to document the fact that fewer people over the last millennia, fewer and fewer people die violent deaths. And even with the threat of weapons of mass destruction in the 20th and now 21st century, that continues to be the case, that fewer and fewer people die in wars and conflicts. But there are, of course, weapons of mass destruction out there and potential weapons of mass destruction which could wreak mega deaths on the earth. And I think it's right to be afraid of them and right to have proactive policies. Of course, the average person has no idea how to assess the relative risks of eating a hamburger versus nuclear terrorism, and they should be far more concerned about saturated fats than they should about nuclear terrorism. But that's the nature of the human mind at this point.
This is not a logical discussion, though. You know, maybe we should be more concerned about, well, I was going to give a brand name there, but I better not. Let's just say hamburgers you shouldn't eat, as opposed to nuclear suitcases. But the fact is, Steven Pinker's work notwithstanding, and he was in that chair a month ago in the studio talking to us about it, we still have an irrational fear of the future. How come?
Well, and I think the hamburger example shows that the threats are still in great abundance. They may not be as great and spectacular as nuclear war, but there is a real feeling that there's danger around the corner. And I think where technology legitimately gives people hope, it's politics and economics that are the source of despair. And people don't feel positive about their economic prospects, and they don't feel empowered. They don't feel in control of their lives and their agency, and nor do they have the trust in elected officials to get them out of the mess they're in terms of rising cynicism.
But that's not all of life, though. All of life is not politics and economics. There's everything else.
But I think what's changed is technology has failed to deliver on that hope. That for a long time, if you want to go back to the Cold War, technology was central to that notion of progress, that notion of delivering us something better, and it hasn't. And I think as younger generations wake up to their parents telling them, look, that bachelor's degree ain't going to cut it. You have to do a lot more if you want to improve the standing of this family. It's that political economy that I think is fueling the depression because technology doesn't deliver the hope.
Madeline, I'm going to do a bit of a setup here. You're from California, right?
I was born in Los Angeles and I spent most of my life outside of Seattle.
Okay, but we all know California is the place where dreams come true. Or it always used to anyway. Some of the dreams come true. The reason I bring this up, a recent Gallup poll suggested that 55% of Americans don't expect the future for their children to be as good as theirs.
Yeah.
And that's completely backwards from a generation ago where, and going back as far as you knew, where everybody assumed their kids would do better than they would. We don't assume that anymore. What's going on here?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on. I think that more and more people, as Jesse pointed out, more and more people are graduating and realizing that the degrees that they hold, that there aren't jobs to be filled, and so on and so forth. And we are also bombarded every day with messages about how in danger we are and what decline the planet is in, and what role the system has in all of that.
The system? What's the system?
Well, I think that more and more we're becoming acquainted with the idea that there is no one cause for everything, that there is no one cause for all of our ills, that things are brought about for a variety of different reasons, and that in order to tackle all of those problems, we need to approach them from a more systemic point of view. We need to look at all of the factors in the equation. And when you look at things that way, they can feel incredibly daunting because you realize it's not the trench run. It's not it's not pulling the sword from the stone. You can't do that. So I think more and more people are realizing the size of the job that's ahead. And that in itself can cause you to take a step back and just say, wow, this is much harder than we all knew it was going to be.
But Robert, your optimism about the future notwithstanding, when you look at television, when you listen to the radio, when you read books, it seems like we are drowning in a miasma of, oh my God, it's all going to hell in a handcart. And presumably the capitalists who write these things and make these TV shows wouldn't do them unless people were buying into it.
But you know what's interesting, Steve, is a generation or two ago, we would write those same stories with real plausible threats. Soviet expansionism, the precipice of nuclear annihilation. And now we're writing these stories with killer robots, zombies, vampires, made up threats to humanity, because in fact when we look around the real world today, we have a hard time turning up anything as monstrous as Nazi Germany or as Stalinist Russia. It doesn't exist anymore.
Are you saying vampires are not real?
I'm afraid to break that to you here, Steve. Vampires are not real. Zombies are not real. However, it should be pointed out that the opposite of progress is Congress, and unfortunately it is real south of the border and has put a lot of brakes on significant things. But in general, yes, of course we look for the war between idealized good and idealized evil, but it's this uprise of fantasy. I'm a science fiction writer, but this uprise of fantasy is in fact, we're casting around looking for something to be our opponent these days and having a hard time coming up with any credible thing except maybe climate change.
I disagree, and I think I agree that the fantasy serves a purpose, but I think it speaks to the complexity, that our society is so complex, people can't decipher it for themselves, so they use fantasy to understand it. And I think the zombies, the vampires, they do speak to people's real fears about genetic engineering, about environmental catastrophe. That, granted, may not be as grounded as a Soviet invasion or the spread of communism, but I think they are real. And I think to dismiss them as fantasy denies the fact that people have anxiety and have these fears, and they are, in some weird metaphorical way, connected to real threats.
I don't think you give enough credit to the average person in the street who actually does understand genetic engineering, does understand the threat of nuclear proliferation of Iran, for instance, in that regard. I don't think we're actually that metaphoric a species. We know what we're afraid of and what we aren't afraid of. And in fact, sure, we're afraid of genetic engineering. I mentioned Congress in the United States, which put the brakes on stem cell research in the United States, which might have given us all better, longer, healthier lives. That was a ridiculous fear put forward and misunderstood by people who were pandering to an electorate. That is a problem. But I think in general, we actually do understand the real threats. Whether or not evolution and evolutionary psychology equipped us with the proper tools to evaluate these things is another question. You speak to the fact that polls show people being enormously afraid, but they don't know what they're afraid of. Exactly our difficulty.
James, I see you trying to get in. Follow up if you would.
Well, I want to make the connection back to the economy again. I think there's a bit of parochialism about the notion that people are pessimistic, because I think vast swaths of Latin Americans, Indians, Chinese are seeing tangible progress in the quality of their life and are, in most of the public polling I've seen, very optimistic about their futures, despite all of the possible economic and ecological threats in the future. Part of the issue here is that people in the industrialized countries are beginning to wake up to the fact that globalization is turning out to be more of a race to the bottom for them, and a pressure on their social welfare states. And that is part of this economic pessimism about the future, combined with ecological threats. We need new paradigms about how to protect the gains and the progress that we've made in the industrialized world in this new globalized context.
Let me invite one more voice into this discussion, at least for a few seconds anyway. You all know William Gibson, the sci-fi writer who lives out in Vancouver. Here's what he's got to say about the future. Michael, roll tape, please.
As a society, I think we've actually come to a parting of the ways with the capital F future, and when I was a kid, the future almost always had a capital F. Everything in it was new and future-y, and it was unconsciously assumed to have no past content.
And better, too, I presume.
Yeah, and everything was better. That's a very North American way of looking at it. The Europeans, who have always had to live, in effect, in their own retrofitted ruins, never really had that. I think they envied us that ability to see the future as all new, all better.
William Gibson in this studio a little over a year ago. So, Madeline, where do you stand on the future with a capital F?
I am not really all that excited about the future with a capital F.
Why not?
Well, okay. So a couple of years ago, I was at a convention where the keynote speakers were Charles Stross, a science fiction writer, and Paul Krugman, the New York Times economist,
Nobel Prize-winning Princeton
yes,
University.
Exactly. So it was pretty amazing to be in that room. And one of the things that Krugman complained about was that when he was a little boy, there was this capital F future. And one of the things that he said was, you know, in the past 50 years, from when I was a little boy to now, the American kitchen has not changed.
What?
He said the American kitchen has not changed. When I was a little boy, we were supposed to be getting to our kitchen in jetpacks, presumably, and the kitchen was supposed to be different, and robots were supposed to be handling it, and it was supposed to be self-cleaning, and it was going to look much better and be far different. And nothing has changed between then and now. And I leaned over to my friend and I said, a lot has changed, actually. There's a man in there now.
Yes.
And you know, and not only is there a man in there now, but there could be two men in there now, and they could be married, and they could adopt a child, and moreover, their refrigerator could be solar powered, and moreover, they could have a refrigerator full of ingredients that are all imported from all over the world, and they could know how to pronounce them.
So the future with a capital F looks good to you then?
But that is not the future with a capital F. That is the sort of ahistorical perfect future, what Mr. Gibson would call the Gernsback continuum. That is, you know, the future that we get to perfectly define, and it is not a globalized future. You know, the Jetsons' future was not necessarily globalized at all. The future that we have is the future that is, you know, the one that we all get to participate. It's a participatory future that is informed by a variety of different sources that we never had access to before. It was easy to you know, look for those threats to look at the communist threat, to look at other different threats and villainize and so on, when we had only a limited source of information, when we didn't have an always on, always diverse feed from everywhere and from different voices, from voices that we never got to hear from before.
Robert.
When Bill Gibson talks about the future with a capital F, it was the consensus future that we all thought was coming. There was one vision, started in some measures you mentioned. Hugo Gernsback, the science fiction writer, the 1939 New York World's Fair, vision of the future, the Jetsons, vision of the future. And
Does everybody get the reference to the Jetsons? It just occurred to me that if you're Jesse's age, you might...
Hanna-Barbera cartoon series, the
It was on
opposite,
rerun
the
for
opposite,
long.
the opposite of the Flintstones, the modern future family instead of the
Yes.
modern Stone Age
Yes,
family.
exactly.
And we all thought that's what we were going to get. Hyper-automation, pill food, robot helpers in the household, flying cars. That was the Jetsons' future. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, actually, in the run-up to the American choosing a Republican candidate, how fractured the views of the future are going to be. Newt Gingrich has come out and talked about colonies on the moon, and it's become risible.
He's become ridiculed for
He's
doing it.
ridiculed
Yeah.
because he has not deviated from the consensual future that we all had 20 or 30 years ago. And now everybody's, are you crazy? Now, I happen to think it would be nice to go to the moon again, but I can't push it over top of any of a long list of other things that we should be doing. Gingrich still believes in the future that Bill Gibson referred to. The rest of us are saying, wait a minute, let's have a discussion about which future we really do want to make it reality.
Can I get James's view on that?
But the Chinese...
Yeah, James, let me just put a question to you as you follow up here, because Gingrich, what he said, for those who missed it, was, by the end of my second term, he said, I would like there to be a colony that the Americans run, flying the Stars and Stripes, on the moon. And he seemed to think that it was possible to have, I think at that point, 10 or 15,000 people living up there. That's 9 years from now. He has been widely ridiculed. Should he have been?
Well, he should be widely ridiculed because he's vile and easily dismissible. But the
Now,
Chinese...
Get off the fence there, James. Tell me what you really think.
The Chinese have been talking about putting a base on the moon for a long time, and I think that they are actually moving towards that project. They're not laughing at this prospect at all. I don't think we should either. I think there should be a more aggressive space program, both for the moon and Mars. And of course, the previous presidents have committed to that, but done nothing in terms of the funding. And even Gingrich's budget proposal was to cut NASA and try to encourage the private sector to go to the moon.
But he's not crazy to want to go to the moon, though.
It's not crazy. I think space is integral to a vision of the human future. The notion that we would forever be confined to this planet, this gravity well, is a very limited vision.
Okay, let me read this from The Economist magazine. This was published a couple of years ago, a few years ago now. And Jesse, come out of this with a question for you. In the rich world, the idea of progress has become impoverished. Through complacency and bitter experience, the scope of progress has narrowed. The popular view is that although technology and GDP advance, morals and society are treading water, or depending on your choice of newspaper, sinking back into decadence and barbarism. On the left of politics these days, progress comes with a pair of ironic quotation marks attached. On the right, progressive is a term of abuse. Do you agree that that future progress has got to be better than things are now, not just more than things are now?
I think that's the project of Western society, yes. And if we regard ourselves as having a commitment to those beyond our family, to society as a whole, yes. But I think the issue that Robert kind of touched upon is that the consensus of the future is gone. And because we can't build that agreement, I think that's why we can't agree what progress is or what advancement should be, so that it's universal and not imperial, to use a juxtaposition.
Well, we know what we don't want, right?
But I think the problem is the present, that we're not all in the same present. I've spent my whole life being dismissed by other people who said that I was from the future, that my understanding of the internet was so ahead of theirs that they didn't have to take it seriously because it didn't apply to their present. And I often find that the way people describe the internet is as a procrastination. Well, that's the future. I don't have to learn about it today. I can still use my telephone and use my pieces of paper and do all the things I do today. So what I see is an entrenchment of the status quo. And that power, which is becoming increasingly illegitimate because of how transparent wealth inequality is, that they're finding ways to further entrench the status quo, and one way is to rob us of the future.
And they're all boomers, no doubt, right?
No, not at all.
No?
I think boomers are our allies, because boomers were the first generation to turn their nose at tradition and say, we with the electronic media can recreate ourselves. And then my generation said, yeah, and said, copyright gone. And let us find an even greater way to reinvent ourselves. And the response is the Stop Online Piracy Act, where power tries to stop it.
Come on in, James.
Well, I think part of the struggle that we're having around the term progress, or the concept of progress, goes back to 300 years of Enlightenment thought that the idea of inevitability of progress was one of the core tenets of the Enlightenment, but another of the core tenets was ruthless use of reason and the tearing away of unsupportable myths. And one of those myths turned out to be the myth of progress, and when you tore it away, you found that it was often being used to rationalize things like imperialism and exploitation. That's all perfectly correct, and we have to open ourselves to the possibility that the future is radically unpredictable and a mix of positive and negative trends that could lead to chaos or utopia. And so any kind of faith in the inevitability of progress is misplaced. But at the same time, what we often see is a kind of counter-Enlightenment trend of people who take the opposite lesson and say that we have to have a faith that we're screwing it up, and that Mother Nature is punishing us, and that we have hubris that we need to be punished for, and that also has to be guarded against.
Yeah.
Madeline, progress in the future for you means what?
I think more for everybody, better things for everyone.
Better and more?
Better, well, more means for more people, I would say, and better things for everyone. I would like to see the continuation of certain trends, like the expansion of rights. I think that the expansion of rights is good. I think that the expansion of communication is good. I think that the expansion of choice is good. I don't necessarily think that the expansion of wealth among that 1% or that top 0.5% is good. I don't necessarily.
How about the expansion of choice? So we should have 2 or 3 tiers of healthcare in Canada then? Is that good? Oh, so you're not in favor of choice then?
I'm not. I am in favor of maintaining things like reproductive choice. I am in favor of maintaining things like the choice to keep communicating online. I think those kinds of choices are good.
Okay, Robert, what does a future with, if I can use her words, more and better mean for you?
Well, the biggest problem actually is the one that Madeline referred to, that 1% or 1/2% who is accumulating everything at the expense of everybody else. The single biggest threat to the survival of the planet is the disgruntled, the angry. Sigmund Freud called it civilization and its discontents. People who are absolutely PO'd by what is going on are more and more getting empowered to take revenge or vengeance. 9/11 is an example of that. A very small number of people who couldn't 100 years ago have done more than hit a few people in the face, killing thousands of people and changing the way we conduct ourselves for over a decade now. We have to give more hope to everybody. We have to give more rights to everybody. We have to give the whole planet a reason to say, hey, I don't want to think about the next world because this one's pretty cool and I want to enjoy it and make the most of it.
Well, let's follow up with James on this. James, you have in your work imagined a better future will be possible with the help of what you call virtue engineering. Help us understand what that is.
Well, first, I would say that some of the basic choices that we would like to be able to make that in a more positive future would be the choice not to die, or the choice about when we die at any rate. So having greater longevity, of course, is a prerequisite for all the other choices that we make. But one of the things I've been very concerned about as we move into an era of cognitive enhancement and biological enhancement is that we'll increasingly have an understanding of and a control over the material basis of our own moral sentiments and moral cognition. We have begun to understand the circuits in the brain that are necessary, responsible, can be damaged, that control compassion, empathy, moral reasoning of various kinds. And we have drugs like oxytocin and serotonin and so forth, which influence how we use those moral judgments. And one of the things I think that we all would like individually as a matter of choice is to have greater willpower, to be able to live up to our own aspirations for ourselves, to have greater patience and compassion for other people. We all have an ideal version of ourselves that we would like to be. Of course, the downside of that is that we may also live in a world in which authoritarian regimes or governments or just social pressures might force people to use those same virtue engineering techniques to control people's behavior, and I think we already see some of that in different places. So this is, I think, one of the central issues, and very few futurists yet have grappled with it, but Robert Sawyer is so far-sighted, I'm sure it's in his next novel.
Oh, it's in previous novels, but thank you for the plug.
Well, as long as RJ's got the floor here, we do want to remind everybody of what we said off the top, that you're going to be on TVO tomorrow and on Sunday, Big Ideas, 5 p.m., with a lecture that you gave at the Gardner Museum all about the future, the issues we're talking about on this very program today. And I think we're going to give everybody a sneak peek of your talk, and then we'll come back for a question for you, okay?
I deliberately wore a different shirt today, so good.
Just to fool us. All right.
Good work.
Michael, if you would, from Big Ideas, roll tape.
Excellent work.
But the fact is that unless you believe in your heart of hearts that your consciousness is divinely endowed, it is within the realm of the physical universe. It can be digitized and copied just like anything else in the physical universe. And that means that at some point in the not too cosmically distant future, you will be able to take your consciousness and move it out of your body or copy it out of your body to somewhere else. If you don't like having a physical body, your notion of getting up in the morning would be so much more pleasant if you didn't have to worry about the bad back, the bad hips, the failing eyesight, the failing hearing. One solution is to correct those biologically. Another solution is to say, you know what, that whole physical thing is so last millennium, and decide instead that you're going to become an uploaded consciousness, a transferred mind.
Okay, that is a big idea. And okay, so let me do this. The physical body is so last millennium, I get that. How appealing do you think the notion of a non-corporeal life to Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario, Canada, world actually is?
It's a matter of choice. I think for the average person, the kind of transhumanism most desired is physical longevity with a hale and hearty body. And I think everybody can say that. If you're 75 and you're starting to fail a little bit and somebody says, well, I can roll you back, to quote one of my novels, roll back and make you physically young again, or I can make sure that you're not going to have cognitive impairments as you get older, the people who would sign up for that would be legion. Leaving the physicality of the human experience will be a minority taste. But as Madeline said, the future is about empowering people to choose things other than the mainstream for themselves. And I think this will certainly be not a vanishingly small part of humanity that will choose to say, you know what, physicality actually wasn't the best thing about me. My spirituality, to use a very loaded term, my cognitive processes were in fact what really mattered to me, and I would like to see those continue.
That's a view of the future that many people could embrace. You, on the other hand, have written a view of the future in your new novel, NV, which I don't think...
VN.
Excuse me, did I write it down wrong? VN, the first machine dynasty.
Yes.
You talk about self-replicating humanoid robots, and I'm not sure that is a vision of the future that people are really ready to embrace. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. You're not wrong, because one of the things about that novel that it openly acknowledges is the fact that you would actually have to be really, really crazy to build humanoid robots. We don't need them. We use robots every day. You know, robots build our cars. Robots build lots of other machines for us. We use them all the time in our world, and they don't look like us. And they don't look like us for a reason, because they don't need to look like us. They do better not looking like us, and they don't need our hands, they don't need our mouths, they don't need all of the apparatuses that make us look like us.
Or a pension.
A pension. And they don't need a pension. And we can just throw them away. So, and we pay people a pittance to do fine tool labor and fine labor in, you know, factories in China.
Which they'll do for free.
Which they do for a tiny little amount that is more than they would otherwise make, and then we lead them to arthritis at 25. But
Until these robots self-replicate, take over the world, and make us scared for our futures.
No. See, this is the thing. I think that you know, when I wrote about that in order to talk about how, in many ways, how silly the idea was, but how, despite the silliness of the idea, we are obsessed with it. We are obsessed with that idea, and we've been obsessed with it. Probably, I would lead that back to the Tanakh. That is right there in Genesis, that we are obsessed with creating things in our own image and endowing them with what we think is our intelligence.
Let's find out if Jesse is fearful or embracing the notion of self-replicating robots or what did you call them?
Transhumanism.
Transhumanism, as Robert J. Sawyer pronounces it.
Yes, I am terrified. You
That's
know,
why you're sitting
there's,
so far
there-
away.
there's I'm at a critical distance. There's a great saying, there's no bad dogs, just bad owners. And when I listen to the way that people talk about robots and talk about machines and talk about them as slaves, it makes me think, you know, rather than have a healthy relationship with our technology, rather than have a healthy relationship with this incredibly powerful emerging technology, we seek to subjugate it. Even worse, we assume that we'll be able to subjugate it, without realizing that regardless as to whether these fantasies come true, if we treat machines this way, we will treat humans that way. And what we're seeing in our society is not so much the rise of machines, but humans acting like machines. I took the subway here, and on the subway and on the street, everyone's plugged in. Everyone's looking at a screen. I mean, granted, you can't make eye contact in Toronto to begin with, but nonetheless, the humanity is disappearing. So I don't fear the rise of the robots. I fear the fall of the humans unto their own selves by neglect and complacency because they're so seduced by the screen that they forget their fellow humans.
James Hughes, where are you on this?
Well, I am a transhumanist, former director of the World Transhumanist Association, as a matter of fact. And I think part of the question here is whether we will identify with and see as successors the non-organic life forms that come in the future, robots or uploaded humans or whatever they might be. Very few of us would want to live lives constrained by the values of our Paleolithic ancestors. Whatever gods they worshipped or whatever values they had are completely irrelevant to us now. And so the notion that there will be future generations of sentient beings who are our descendants, who are the products of our work and our labor, who are radically different from us and who we can't currently identify with, I think is inevitable and something that's probably welcome. But it's not necessarily progress, because progress is in the eye of the beholder, but it is inevitable.
With just a few minutes left here, let me put one more idea on the table for your analysis. Which statement is more accurate? The future, we can shape it in the way that we want to, or the future is out there, but technology will have its way with us regardless. Robin.
Oh, the former. The future is ours to make. We are, he talked about our Paleolithic ancestors. We are tool-making creatures who have always been the masters of our tools. We will continue to be the masters of our tools. The robot is simply the descendant of the chert nodule that has been napped into something useful. We will make a bright, sunny tomorrow because that is in our dispositions to make that. It has been what we've been working towards. We're in a continuum that is nowhere near its end. And I think very much we have the ability to choose what tomorrow is going to be.
See,
Jesse?
I think that's fiction, because I think that
Well,
while I
business.
agree with the sentiment that the future is there for us to shape it, the prerequisite is our understanding of the present. And at that, we are clueless. Until we understand, this is Ursula Franklin, until we understand where we are, we cannot know where we want to go. And where we have within us the power to go where we want to go, we cannot get there until we talk honestly about where we are. And other than TVO and maybe CBC, that doesn't happen. Because Fox News, Sun TV, there's no reality there. So until we have the present as a discussion, then the future to me doesn't exist because we're not prepared for it, we're not ready for it.
And yet the Steven Pinker that you suggested, Better Angels of Our Nature, is a international bestseller. The fact is these things are on the table and are part of public discourse.
Madeline, we can shape the future or the technology will shape us?
Oh, I think that it's both. I mean, we build our technology to satisfy our own desires. And then that technology provides us with the ability to satisfy desires we didn't know we had. And I think it's that. I think it's a complicated dance step where you know, it's like anything else. You move into it. You move into, you know, into something. You move into buying a house. You move into a relationship. You move into something, and then you find yourself using it for all these other different things that you didn't know you could. You know, that is the definition of using something off-label. Now we prescribe drugs off-label all the time, and we use technologies off-label all the time. And that's now the use of technologies in the developing world consistently. Is, you know, we've developed all of these things, and we thought that we knew what we were selling them to the customer for. And now we find out that, you know, the little flip phone that we now consider outdated is used to, based on the number of rings, to transmit hugely vital information about the location of retroviral drugs in Africa. So, I mean,
let me save a minute here for
great.
James Hughes. Come on in, James, and finish us off tonight.
Well, I agree that humans and technology have been co-evolving since flint-knapped tools and fire, and that we will continue to co-evolve into whatever we become next. I think one of the critical questions that we face is the development of new forms of governance, especially at the global level, which allow us to get a hand through democratic participation on some of the technological threats, existential, catastrophic threats that technology may pose for the future. We definitely do need to develop that kind of direct democratic participation.
Interesting. What a great discussion about the future. Thanks so much, everybody. And I want to thank James Hughes for being there in our studios in Hartford, Connecticut, the bioethicist at Trinity College. Here in our studio, Madeline Ashby. Madeline, the name of your new book is?
VN.
VN. Want to get the initials right this time. Jesse Hirsch from MetaViews.ca and Robert J. Sawyer, Canada's best-selling science fiction writer, with book number 21 out there right now, and we're going to be watching you on the weekend as well. Yes. Big ideas from the Gardner Museum. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.